Good morning and a Freilich Hanukkah. We are middle of the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, which is the part of the foundational text of Ayin Beis that we have concluded, based on the Alter Rebbe's Hanukkah Maimer, Mika Hashem Elokeinu, Hamagbil Sheves, Hamashpili Lires, and we're on page in this Maimer on page 367. Learning about the contrast between the Nefesh Halikis and Nefesh Habamis, where one is divine, Ruach HaAdam Eil Lamayla, aspiring to transcendence, to that which is beyond the self and the ego and the needs of the person, and the other is the Nefesh Habamis, Ruach HaBehema Yeredes Lamata, that's focused Lamata on the physical existence, the needs, the emotional needs of and subjective needs of the person, self-interest. And this affects both the seichel and midas of each of them. In the divine soul, the seichel is a seichel that's involved only exclusively in understanding and knowing God and what God wants. The divine, and it affects, it gives birth when you contemplate on that, and midas, atul chadasha yitzira, yetzer tev, from the word yitzira, that it shapes and forms an emotional reaction, emotional birthing of the feelings of love and reverence to the divine. On the other hand, l'umazeh, on the other side of the spectrum, the diametric opposite side, the Nefesh Habamis seichel is involved in understanding existence, understanding of what our needs are, using your seichel to live a better life, to be happier, to be wealthier, to reach greatness, to justify or to explain everything that in your interest, explaining your position and how it should be to serve you with a pikus, with a sharpness, with wisdom, and so on. And even that's the seichel that's shaykh to midas. And even the seichel that's not shaykh to midas, like science. He gave the examples of nature, science, astronomy, medicine, and so on. There too, its focus is understanding the gashmis of the existence, the yesh, dissecting the anatomy of existence, taking it apart, how it's made up of different parts. The focus is not on the divine energy within it, but what the divine created, on the creation, on the product, not on the producer of the product. So it's focused on the yesh, whereas the Nefesh Halikis focuses on the ayin alaki that gives it energy, that sustains everything all the time, and is its purpose, and also focuses on everything in existence is nullified compared to its source. Whereas someone involved in understanding the product itself, it's not nullified. That's the more he understands, the more he becomes connected to the yesh of existence. Yeah. And I gave the example, like someone who says, Misha Amr l'shemen yadlik, biyadlik, you're focusing not on the shemen, but the one that gave the power to oil to be fuel, and that's the divine force within it, divine words within it, as opposed to the very nature of the object itself. And as such, seichel anushi on its own, divorced, like he says, that's the hasikol akshama commission ivdelis min aruchnius, as it's divorced from ruchnius. That's a dimyan chayzer v'sheker. That will create a false impression, and actually be wrong, because it's like saying you're only focusing on the product, you're forgetting about the producer within the product. The Nogah is the seichel aliki, the Nefesh Halikis, which focuses on the energy. It's like looking at the outer surface of an object and not understanding the energy within it. La'asid love, that will be revealed. All called basar, all flesh will see the divine. And today we have an example. He gave the paris, the cows that were carrying, the animals that were carrying the odin, sensed the odin. They had a higher sense. They did not just follow their own whims. Right. So what means ruach habehemi redes lamata goes on the seichel and das of the Nefesh Habamis, which is called Nefesh Hachiyunis Hativis. It goes downward, and that needs to be lifted up. That's Zekev Kfufim, to lift up, to rise the downward ones, the ones that are bent forward, the bent down, that's lifting up the Ruach HaBehema, which goes downward because the Ruach HaBehema walks on all four, to walk upright like the animal soul in a human being and follow the divine that looks up and looks at the Creator instead of looking down on earth for its own needs and sustenance of its own self-interest. That's where we reach the bottom of page 367. Okay. Ready to continue? So at the bottom of page 367 can be found at ayinbeis.com if you want to follow the text, or I'll read it and explain it regardless whether you're following it or not. V'hinei, now the next section, he's going to bring another point, which is not, this again is elaboration of the Mittler Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe does not spell it out. So the Mittler Rebbe, what we learned till now, has explained in much more depth why the Nefesh Habamis Seichel is false, because it's missing the main purpose of it all, where it comes from, what drives it. But there's another thing the Mittler Rebbe is adding, why it's called Yetzer Hora and Yetzer Tev. Yetzer, from the word Yetzirah. And his main chiddush by Nefesh Elikis was Yetzirah, because the Nefesh Elikis on its own is not always in a state of love and the mind of the Nefesh Elikis is not always in a state of love and reverence. That's a Pel de Chatul de Chadosha that it gives birth to, as we learned on page 365. So the way it is, the Nefesh Elikis itself is divine, but then there's Nefesh Elikis as it gives birth, Yetzer Tev, to the emotions, to divine emotions. Yeah. So in other words, there's Nefesh Elikis in its source, like Yechida, where it's purely divine. Then it comes down and branches down into a structure of Bria, Yetzirah, as we learned there. So he's going to explain the same thing as with the Nefesh Habamis. The Nefesh Habamis is not always on its own. It's rooted in a place that is about self, meaning it's rooted, like he said, Toyu, where you don't have that balance. But at the end of the day, the very emotions of the animal soul is another aspect to the animal soul that goes beyond the seichel of the animal soul. Now, why this is so crucial is because when we talk about transforming the animal soul, if the animal soul was completely only consumed with midas and didn't have seichel, or seichel was only an adjunct, only a secondary thing, then you would have a problem. How are we going to transform the animal soul? So it's important to explain that the animal soul could be reasoned with. It's not purely an animal. Like for example, you can't reason with an animal. You can't go ahead and say to an actual animal in the field and say, listen, let's say Shema Yisrael together, and then Baruch Shem, and you'll learn to align yourself to godliness. First of all, the animal doesn't go there, doesn't think that way. Second of all, it's not even the purpose. The animal is serving what God wants in the field. It's the animal soul that is part of the human being that can go in both directions, that can either follow its own interests and be seduced by its own desires, or can be taught to be followed to become shemen, oil, that will fuel the divine soul. So that's why it's so critical to establish that the animal soul also has seichel and midas, and they're not the same thing. That's why you can reason with it and ultimately train it, which you could not do with an animal, a pure animal, which is perhaps why he brings the idea that the Nefesh Habamis is not like an animal that walks on all four. It does walk upright. So it's conducive, will be responsive to the divine soul. So the same thing, so therefore these two aspects of saying the Seichel and Midas are not one is very vital, which we're going to learn now inside. So he says like this, V'hine, and now, Ki Yetzer b'zeyu, V'hine, K'moshe mavur l'mayla. Like it was explained above, we're talking about on page 365, why it's called Yetzirah. V'inyan atam shenikra Yetzer Tev. Why it's called Yetzer Tev? It's not just called Tev, Yetzer Tev, the side, the good inclination, the Yetzer, the side of Tev, b'chinas Yetzirah dafke, which Yetzer comes from the word Yetzirah, shaped, the shape of good, it's being shaped into goodness. So it's not just a raw entity, it's been shaped. Mishum she'ispailas hamidas dafke ba'aviyira d'gdusha, nimshu b'chinas tul d'chadosha, memokir harishin ha'atzmi shenikar emek Tev. So what did we learn there? Because initially, it's not been shaped yet. In its root, this divine soul is just a divine soul, like we learned Yechida, or in Keser, or the Mazel, or he called Selam. It's in a form of Makiv that has not yet been defined in a particular form of experience. It's just a divine entity. So that's what he says, because the Ispilus Hamidus, meaning the excitement, the stimulation of the emotions, ba'ava v'yira, with love and reverence of Gedusha, comes b'chinas tul de chadosha. It's like a new birthing, like a Yetzira chadosha. Tul de chadosha means a new birthing, so something new has been shaped. Memakar addition from its original source, ha'atzmi, the core source, which is called emek tev, as we learned earlier. Emek tev, in the depth, like the root of the nefesh alikis. Then the nefesh alikis travels, and it comes down into a structure, different types of souls, and like he said, from etzem atev, now it's taken on the shape of actual midas. Yeah. So just as it is in Kedusha, he says, Hinekach yuvan gamkein, just as it is in the Nefesh Alikis, and the divine soul will also understand similarly, be'ezelu umazeh, in the other side, zelu umazeh asalikim, God created zeh, le'umazeh, this corresponding to this, meaning parallel realities, or like an alter ego. So the same thing we'll understand on the other side of the coin, the other end of the spectrum, which is the animal soul. Gam b'nefesh habamis. Also in the animal soul, it also works that way. Shehi gam ken ruchni is be'etzem. Nefesh habamis, fundamentally, is a ruchnistic entity. It desires in this world physical things, but it says ruchnistic be'etzem rakshu ruach gasa. The problem is the spirit of the ruach, the ruchnis, the ruach, the spirit of it. Is gas, is thick, it's coarse, it's crass. The ruach of nefesh alikis is ruach ha'adam eila lamayla. It's sublime. It seeks transcendence. Ruach habehema is yeded this lamata, so it's a ruach gasa. Keruach habehema mamish. Next page, 368. So it's also ruach, but it's a ruach of a behema mamish. But as we learned, this behema has a source, a root and a source. Shemisham nimshach of a nechtzeva etzem mitziyusa ba'akshama haruchnis. Ba'akshama haruchnis kol kach. So it too has a source from where it was drawn, from where it extends, from where it's transmitted. The nechtzeva, from where it was chiseled. Like when you say something, you take let's say, you take from a mountain, you chisel out a piece of rock, or any particular rock. It has a source where you draw it from, where it was chiseled from. Etzem mitziyusa b'akshama haruchni is kol kach. Meaning, relatively speaking, it has become b'akshama haruchnius because it is a ruchnistic thing, but it's akshama, meaning it's drawn to gashmis, to materialism. So what is that root? Hainu mibchinish Maamorei AdHamtz. So Maamorei AdHamtz literally means the waste of the Efanim shebeichol is the Kelipas Nogah. Let me explain. From the chambers of Kelipas Nogah. So we learned, if you remember in Ayin Beis, that the root of the Nefesh Habamis, well, we learned it also here, the root of Nefesh Habamis is in Toyu, in the Zion Midas of Toyu. But then when it comes down into the worlds, the root of the Nefesh Habamis, we learned in Ayin Beis, is from the Malachim. You remember. Let's go back to the Ayin Beis, just to give you the page where he spoke about it. It comes from the Malachim. That's why we say Birchas Yetzer before Shema, because it comes to soften up and somewhat weaken the hold of the animal soul by invoking its source. I'm sure you remember that. Let me tell you exactly where that is. Here we are. Page 1444. She said like this. Sherish chayes efzum pnei nesher. She said, "Nefesh habamis shebeguf nagash beklum kol." Just look at the actual expression here. Sherish nefesh adam is pnei adam. Good. Okay, so he says there clearly the animal soul is rooted in the malachim, and he brings the lashon mokra chetzva, similar expression like he said here. Yeah. So in Malachim itself, you have three types: Srafim, Chayes HaKodesh, and Efanim. They usually correspond to Bria, the Malachim of Bria, the Malachim of Yetzira, and the Malachim of Asiya. So when you say Efanim, you're talking about the Malachim of Hecholas, the Klipas Nogah. So these are considered, when Kabbalah calls, the chambers of Klipas Nogah, where you already don't have pure elikus. Atzilus lo yigur chara. Doesn't have any klip in it. Everything there is holiness. In Bria, it says, is beginning to Rubei Tev, Umechza, un Amiute Ra. That's the expression in Eitz Chaim. In Yetzirah, it says, Mechza Tev, Mechza Ra. Half good, half bad. But bad here doesn't mean evil. It means that the Klippa, the Yesh, is beginning to become more and more powerful. The Kelim. Then in Asi, you start saying Rubei Tev, Rubei Ra, and Mi'ute Tev, meaning the consciousness has now become almost completely independent. It's still Ruchniisdik, because it hasn't in this world, we don't even feel, we only feel the yeshus of the world. And we have to work on any form of bittul. In Bria Tzir Asir Ruchniis, there is bittul. The question is what extent. So Natzilus is Kule Kedusha, like a tzaddik. Sometimes it says that Yitzir is like a Beinani. Bria would be a tzaddik. It depends on different ways it's explained. And Asi is like a Rasha, the Tevle. So bottom line is that the level of Efanim is in the process of how the divine energy revolves. We know, we talked before the Tzimtzum, it's completely elikus, like Atzil is the Klolos. After the Tzimtzum, we know it evolves where the energy is more intense and the Kelim are less. There comes a point in Atzilus where it's a perfect world, fully balanced. But then you want to have existence like we have it, the Oyer starts getting more and more diminished. The Parsa after Atzilus is like the partition that conceals. So now Bria is already a world of a Yesh. It's not a Yesh that defies God, but it's a Yesh as an independent entity. So the angels in Bria are still completely connected to God, but by choice, by Avodah. Then the Yetzirah becomes less so, and I see even more self. The self becomes more defined, and that's the Shmorei Efanim from the level of Asiyah, which becomes the root of the Nefesh Abamis, that below, once you get into this world, the Nefesh Abamis focus is on itself until it's trained otherwise. So that's what he's saying. Okay, so what do you have? So like he said before, just like the Nefesh Alikis has a root and a source in the highest levels of Kedusha, the animal soul also has a Ruchni and also has a source. Its source is in Toyu, but in lower levels, it's in the Shmorei Efanim, in the Eicholos of Klipas Nogah. Remember, Toyu does not yet have Klipah. There is Toyu, there's Eris and Kelim, but after Shviris HaKelim, you have Eicholos of Klipas Nogah that emerge in the lower worlds. Shemepnei etzem b'riyusa kach, being that this is how it was initially created, the Nefesh Abamis. Al kein ha-nefesh hahi tmidis b'efen zeh. So since it's been chiseled from, it's rooted in a place of Klipas Nogah, so it always remains that way. V'hu b'hamshachas hagashmis de'elam hazeh kesher le'esav. That it's always being drawn to materialism. That's its nature from its birth, from its root. So even when it becomes a Yetzirah, we'll soon learn about that more. But even when it becomes a creation, it's drawn to Elam Hazeh, Kesher le'esav, like an animal to grass. When you see an animal grazing the grass, it's naturally inclined to do so. The same thing, the Nefesh Abamis is naturally inclined to feed itself, whether it's grass or it's the physical world, the materialism that feeds it, like we learned earlier. All because it was rooted in a place of Hecholos the Klipas Nogah. Since it's rooted there, That's why its nature below is the same way. So now he says, Kach zeh, so too is it, ha-seichel v'amidas hativim, that the seichel and midas hativim, the natural intelligence and emotions of the animal soul, neitim tamid linyoni hageshem, are always inclined, are always drawn to, gravitate to matter, physical matters. Bli shinui klal, which means this is its nature, nothing changes. That's its very essential nature. Like we learned earlier, what's the seichel of nefesh habamis on its own, or the midas and the midas of nefesh habamis? Self-preservation, survival of the fittest, if you wish. That is the very nature of the animal soul. But we haven't gotten into a particular emotional experience yet of Ava V'yira. Like we talked before about the Nefesh Elikis, the nature of Nefesh Elikis is divine. So it's drawn to everything that's divine. Now he's going to talk about why it's called Yetzer Hora, Yetzirah. Right? He's described how the Nefesh Habamis is shaped. So basically, it's like saying a child of parents is going to naturally have the DNA and the genetic makeup and the personality of its parents, because that's where you're coming from. Without getting into details, that does not change. Now he's going to talk about the shifts that happen in the Nefesh Habamis' journey. But let me stop here if anybody wants to ask anything about what we've learned so far. Okay. However, now in that which at times we find tispal hanefesh hagasa azeis, this nefesh hagasa azeis, this crass spirit, because it is a spirit, ruach habehema, but it's a crass one, gasa. At times we find that it does get excited, it does get stimulated. Bihispilus yisera mikafi hamida v'regilusa hatmidis sheba, more than its natural, measured, routine nature. Bahainu, we'll find this is when the animal soul gets aroused. That is hainu aispilus ha'ava v'acheshik l'tayvos nafshe b'yesem mekafi ha'seichel ha'manig midis sheba tamid. That at times we'll find that there'll be awakening, a stimulation of a love and a passion to fulfill its desires more than the usual seichel that governs these midas on a regular basis. So in other words, think of an animal. An animal is grazing in the grass. That's its natural nature. Then suddenly it sees something. It sees a potential breeding partner, let's say. Or it sees a particular special juicy food that it likes. So now, more than its regular survival experience, it now suddenly arouses with a certain passion. So he says the same thing with the Nefesh Habamis. The Nefesh Habamis generally focused essentially on self-interest and survival and its own existence. But there are times where there'll be something will awaken it to want something more. This is called a new birthing. This is called the Yetzirah. This is a new birthing. Because it's not it's not its regular routine. Something new has happened. Where does it originate from? Like we spoke with the Nefesh Elikis and Kedusha, it originates from the source that, in fact, remember, Keser, that impacts Chachma and Bina, that in turn impacts the emotions to give birth to something. So let's say parents love each other, but it doesn't mean they're always giving birth to a child. Emotion, the seichel doesn't always give birth to an emotion. Here we're talking about that is giving birth. That's a tulda chadasha that's coming from the sheirish harishin shabab b'chinas teisvis rav v'chodesh miikore, but it's coming now with an additional surge and new, something more than it was there in the regular flow, because now you have this emotional, passionate stimulation. Shabab b'chinas emek ra shebesherish nefesh habamis, that comes from the emek ra, from that depth, from that root source of the nefesh habamis, b'chinas makiv the kisrin the Kelipas nega, that comes from the kisrin, the level of the makiv, of the crowns of Kelipas nega. Remember, he said kisrin the masavusa, just like there's Keser and Kedusha, there's also Keser and Kelipah. That's where it's coming from. Why Keser? Because Keser is an additional surge. It's like a Ratzon. Keser is Ratzon, and Tainug actually also. So you can have the regular flow of your regular, let's call it your day-to-day routine existence. And then there's now an arousal, an awakening of an additional passion that's coming from the root of the Kisrin, the Maki of the Keser of Kelipas Nogah, that is now feeding and creating, birthing a new emotion, a new passion. Calls the Kisrin of Kelipas Nogah, he says, Shinikroim Tseil Makif, they're called like the shadow, and a Makif, meaning it's like a more hovering energy. Just like before we poked in Kedusha, it was called Selam Elakim. It said Ach Ish. He called before. He said the Ach, but Selam is Salach Ish. So Selam in Kedusha is Selam with a mem, the image of God. Seil without the mem is the shadow of Kelipah, the Makif. Like we learn in Pasha Shlach, he says, remove your shadow, remove your source from them. When Kolav and Yeshua are talking about the Meraglim, they say, remove the tzeil, their energy source. So you have it in Kedusha and you have it in Kelipah. That's the root in Keser. And now he explains further. I'll stop shortly for questions, but let me just continue the full idea. Because it's very possible. It's possible that a person could be in a state where the midas and sechel and nefesh habamis are active. The emotions and the intelligence is active. All day long. It doesn't mean he's constantly stimulated by some taiva. The nefesh habamis, even when it's in the throes of passion, it doesn't mean it's constantly that way. It's possible that the person could be having the regular so-called functional seichel and midas, or midas and seichel nefesh habamis, without this additional stimulation or excitement or arousal of ava or yira kol yem. Rak leprokim. It's only at intervals, at times. Yovelei hispilus will come. Will this be the stimulation of these taivas that he's talking about? Pa'amokes das machshava l'ra. When he concentrates with depth, the das and machshava for something that's negative. So it's not every second a person has a machshava zara. So a person can be functioning, regular animal soul functionality, which means you eat, you sleep, you do business. Kelipas Nogah doesn't mean that. Yeah, and then there's times, intervals where there's suddenly a surge of passion for something that's not kosher, that's not divine. And it's not all times that he gets excited or stimulated. Though he may be thinking machshava zara, doesn't mean even if you have a machshava zara called an alien thought about something that's not kedusha, it does not mean every time you just get stimulated to go be drawn to it or attracted to it. He's distinguishing. If you remember, he said the same thing. That doesn't mean that nefesh alekis always has the passionate love and reverence of the divine. He said that on page 1365 very explicitly. So we see here that there are two states here. There's the natural routine state, and then there's this additional surge. Here, of course, it's for taivas. What we must say, that when you do have the birthing, and it gets excited and stimulated, temporarily, nikra tul de chadasha. It's called a new birthing. Lefi shaloi haya begili adayim benefezu. Rak behelam b'makif. Because it was not revealed, the person did not have it in a revealed way until this moment. It was concealed in a state of makif. V'helidei begili yispailas belev bosar b'b'kinas tesus. The tesus of chudesh mi'kareh. And now, when it is stimulated, it's coming in a spiral beloved basar. The heart, the physical heart, is feeling it, and here you have this additional surge, a new surge, from its root. Where's this additional surge coming from? It's not coming from any outside place. So you have to say it's coming from its source. But until it wasn't stimulated within you, it remained makivdik. So it comes from its source, shenikra emakra canal, which is called the emakra, the depth of Ra, meaning the source. Like when you say the emek, the water that comes out on the face of the earth comes from an emek, from a deeper mayon, a spring of water that's hidden within. Same thing here. It was there, but it was concealed. Makiv. Now it's been stimulated as a tool to chadasha. Uke'inyan sha'amar. It's like what we say, habolatame peschin le'shade tuma. That a person, unfortunately, sadly, comes to be impurified. Habolatame, in other words, he's doing something that is going to bring impurity into his life. So what happens is they open up for him gates of tuma. You want it? Okay. So you began by person, in other words, brought upon themselves something negative. They brought through their thoughts, through their focus, their concentration. So comes shari tumashain kisin de mesavusa. Those are the crowns of impurities, the shari tuma. But it came, so it's abolatame, ukumavur bezeir become a duchtem, as explained in Zeir in a number of discourses, a number of places. Bezeu atam. And this is the reason shenikra b'shem Yetzer Hora meloshin Yetzira. Why it's called Yetzer Hora. Yetzer, from the word Yetzira, means shaped, formed. Shenetzer Hora, because this Ra, in its source, was not yet drawn out from. There was it's hidden. Is the Ra was shaped and formed. Hazeh memkede b'chinas Hara atzmi hanal, ha'atzmis hanal, from its source. In the Merkara Ra Atzmis Hanal that we spoke about, the Kisrin, the Ksarim, or we spoke earlier, the Shmari Efanim, or actually Keser, all the way up to the Keser. Shenikra Emek Ra HaKavua B'nefesh HaBamis. So the Emek Ra Kavua, it's always there. That's where the Nefesh HaBamis is shaped from. But that expression of our particular stimulated negative emotion, it happens only from time to time. But where is it coming from? From there, but it's like an additional surge that's coming from the deeper place of where the Nefesh HaBamis is rooted from all the time. That's the core. Then a state of atzmis, it's always there in the core place. Let me stop here if anybody has any questions. Then I'll finish the last few lines here. I read a lot.
I have a question,
Okay.
please. So he's talking about the source of the Nefesh HaBahamis and what the source from which it yields these taivas, and it has the Rebbe has referred to it as this ophanim of a sea, I guess, and also the kisrin of the makif of I guess of that of Kelipas Nogah, I guess. But my question is, I thought the source of the Nefesh HaBahamis was all the way from Tohu. So I'm wondering why it's not that he's not, the Rebbe's not like it's when you start talking about Ophanim or you start talking about Keser or Kisri, obviously these are elevated sources. They're not like in the lowest realm, but they're certainly not from Tohu. And I'm just wondering when he's talking about the source and the
Tohu. The crowns of Misavusa is Tohu.
Oh yeah? Oh, there you have it. Okay. I didn't know that. Thank you. What is the literal translation of Kisrin to the crowns
Kisrin
of
means
what?
Ksarim. As I mentioned, the spears in Tohu, when I spoke about it in the beginning, when we first learned about it, we learned about it in, where was the first place? Kisrin Misavusa. Well, Kisrin means Ksarim, because Tohu, the spheres of Tohu are like Makifim, they're not fully integrated, so they're like Keser. The Rotzen, like intense Rotzen, and Misavusa in Aramaic simply means Tuma. Misavusa is like the word Tuma, like Zuma, Tuma. Savusa.
Okay.
The Kisrin is Savusa, the Kisrin of the impure, basically, the crowns of impurity, if you wish.
Uh-huh.
He brings it in Tanya too.
Okay.
Yeah. On the lower level, it goes through the Shmari Haifanim in the Elamis, but it's rooted in Tayu. The first place he brought this was a few pages back. Let me see. Remember, Kislim Misavus at the end of a Shabbat. Okay, yeah, here it is. On page 363 at the bottom. At the bottom. Last line.
363.
Okay.
5 pages up. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. Any other questions? And the original source is in Zayar, I see. Zayar Shmini, yeah. The Ikar Shvira, yeah, good. Now he says like this: Ukamoy vayar esaom kibrahu. So in Parshat Kisisa, when it says that they built the Chet Egel, the Egel Azov, the golden calf, it says he looked and saw that they are berah, they are immersed in evil. I see below he says a combination of 2 verses. So he's bringing this as proof. That's not always the case, that a person is immersed in something negative. Even though the Nefesh HaBamis in general is rooted in that place, but then there are times when there's a particular stimulation. Not sure what the raya is here in Vayar Sa'am. Does it mean that the stimulation of their sin, or it means that Bera is that they are always in that state? I don't think he means that. I'm not sure. Oh, they zeichen rei Maamorei AdHamtz sorry. The common involved. Just to say, I want to just see what the context is. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's being brought that there are times you saw the nation that they have now entered in that state. That means something was stimulated to go there. Okay. And now he concludes with a parenthesis. Va'omnom, komoisha mavur l'mayil b'nefesh l'kis. But now, however, the way it was explained earlier about the divine soul, same idea, Yetzer Tov, of course, in the side of Kedusha, Shenema ba bria v'yitzira. Remember, we learned that in parentheses on 365. He said it says bria yitzira on the neshama, but he says that's the way the neshama as it comes down into structure. Gam be'etzem koidim shenechel kol naran b'moich v'lev, that we find nefesh l'kis bria v'yitzira as it is in its core. Before it was broken down to nefesh, ruach, neshama, in a mind and a heart. If you look at the parentheses at the end of the paragraph on page 365, he talked about that. So there's a level that's be higher than Bri Yitzira, and then there's Bri Yitzira as it comes down. And he said that even before it breaks down into levels, in the source you already have all these levels encompassed. He says, Kach bo zelo umazeh. Same it is with zelo umazeh and nefesh habamis. Yes, kach bo zelo umazeh. Yes, kach bo. It comes into zelo umazeh. But yes, bechinas ruach v'nefesh the Kelipah Nogah. There's a nefesh, there's a ruach and nefesh of Kelipah Nogah. Shein kemalochim royim the Kelipah Nogah. They're like the negative angels. of Klipas Nega of the transparent of the what do we say it Klipas Nega shein klulim ke'echad b'mikedim b'keser the Klipas Nega, that are all encompassed together in the Keser of Klipas Nega. So that was an additional point that he made there, that as it comes down into structure, first it's originally in a place, like I mentioned example, it's all included in the source. So he says, just as it is in Kedusha, in the Nefesh Elikis, so too in the Nefesh Abamis, it's included in the source, and then it breaks down into levels. That's what he adds here in this parentheses. Okay. So that concludes this paragraph on page 368. And he concludes, now knowing that we have these two forces within us, the divine soul, the animal soul, that work the same way, but obviously in two different realms. One is toward Elikus, and one is toward self-interest. And that's why it's called Yetzer Tev, the Midas, that are born. As I said, I believe that this is going to be vital in understanding how you transform the animal soul, by understanding its different states, how it is in its natural state and how it is when there's an additional surge. In other words, that the Midas get awakened. And that's going to help us understand how we can harness the animal soul, but it's not there yet. The next piece is now going to talk about how they meet each other. What happens now the Nefesh Elikis, Nefesh Abamis come together? We learned about them now as two separate entities with very different personalities. The next piece is going to be how they come together. But if anybody has any questions, let's take them. If not, I'll continue reading and learning.
Yes, please. If no one else has any question, I have another one. I know this is somewhat secondary, but what is this idea of Malachim Raim? I mean, I understand there are some Malachim that are up to no good, like the Satan, but it's not evil. It's just doing what the divine will instructed it to do. So I don't understand this concept of the quote unquote evil angels or bad angels. I don't get that.
Well, the word Ra, Chassidus, should not be confused with the word Ra in our vernacular of daily day talking. When you say evil, means if the Malach was sent to do something evil, we will call it an evil angel, not because it's evil, because that's his message. So, for example, when the Malachim came to destroy Sodom, they would be called Malachim in that sense. They were doing God's will. Or Malachim that come, or like the story you mentioned, Satan. The Satan is L'Shem Shamayim. The Malach is doing what God wants, but the fact is, his job is to tempt. So that's where it comes down to becoming, think of it like a negative energy, if you wish. Some Malachim, and they don't want to do it. That's it's not a job you want. Malach HaMavis doesn't want to take anyone's life, but that's what God chose him to do. So in that sense, that's one point. There's another point, is that there are Malachim actually. There's a sefer called Malachi Elyon from Rab Reuven Margolis, where he names all the Malachim, and they're Malachim of Kedusha and they're Malachim of Kelipah. So there are actual angels that are just like Bilam and Moshe. Both are prophets of God, but it's Zelumazeh. Moshe was a divine prophet, so was Bilam. But Bilam was a prophet that also had evil intentions. He couldn't do anything God didn't tell him to do, but he did have a mind of his own. And he also had, so therefore everything in Kedusha is going to have a counterbalance in Kelipah. So you'll have what they call shadim, for example, demons. And those are negative forces. Angels with bad energy. So that's in addition to what I just said. Whether he's referring to that here or not, I don't know. He may be. Malachim royim in that sense. Now, do they have bchira, free will? They don't have really free will, but it's like we talk about times of the year. The month of Adar is a month that's conducive to joy. The month of Av is a month that's conducive for sadness, which means you should avoid certain things. So it's not like a bad month, but it's a bad, we'll call it disposition. It's like a predisposition for negative things, as a predisposition for positive things. So essentially there are angels that carry, like Malach Machal, Malach Gavriel, they carry good message, they carry good divine energy, and there are angels that carry negative divine energy. Like when God sends an angel to do something, unfortunately, to punish or to destroy or to or the different stories we find, that malachim are sent for that purpose. The malachei Kabbalah, they're called sometimes, the destructive angels. So you have that concept. It doesn't really want to go into it here in detail, but there is the concept of malachim that are messengers. It's like a king. He has messengers that come and bring you good news, and then there are the messengers that the hangman, for example, the people who are there to bring the bad news, so to speak.
Thank you.
Like the angels that destroyed Saddam? Would they be considered that, or are they good angels?
Well, I don't like the word good or bad angels. That's not really how I would define it. I would call it angels that are channels for good energy and angels channels for negative energy. The Saddam, I mean, at the end of the day, they brought justice to Saddam. Saddam deserved it. But the fact of the matter is, God did not choose the Malach Machol of Chesed to bring that. He chose Gavriel, the Malach of Gvura. So, like for example, he mentioned the Satan and so on. Think of it as energies instead of think of it as, it's not humans. We're not talking about good people, bad people. We're talking about good energy, bad energy, or negative energy.
But they in themselves are not negative. They're just carrying that energy.
Because they have no free will, so they're just carriers. But like I said, the king has his ministers that bring benevolence to his people. And then he has the hangman. He has his called the people who are
executioners.
Executioners. Or like we see even about God, you say he sits on the throne of judgment or on the throne of rachamim, of compassion.
Okay, thanks, Rabbi.
I wonder if you could even touch like Tov and Ra here, Ra meaning like counterproductive to the channeling of divine energy. You once talked about Ra as something that's torn. It's like disconnecting. So it's an energy that essentially cuts one off from channeling godly energy. Can you go that far?
You could. Yes, you can. If you want to talk about it more psychologically, it'll be easier to understand. I mentioned the other day, I don't know if it was in this class, in some class that I gave, when you look at people who became mass murderers or serial killers or psychopaths and so on. So yes, it can sometimes be identified to a gene, to something missing, some screw missing and so on. But very often you'll find in their lives, they grew up in very unhealthy environments, either dysfunctional, abusive, that created monsters. They created a certain type of person. So there's a thing called a breeding ground. In other words, I'm not talking about now exceptions, but there are situations where you could say a breeding ground. You grow up, for example, I'm sure in Gaza, you growing up with a lot of hatred from a young, impressionable child, a newborn child, is growing up with a lot of very, very negative stuff about Israel, about Jews, and the same thing in other societies. So the breeding ground itself is the place where it's rooted, but it's not yet become full-blown evil until it does. My point that I'm saying in the Shtalshalus, you have to think of it this way. This is the way to really get a good picture. When you talk about Eirei Self-Finite Symptom, there's a reason we talk about that reality. Not because we live there, and not because we can even imagine it, frankly. But we can, by contrast, say, that's a world where only divine consciousness. There's no duality, there's no plurality, there's no other agendas, there's no self, there's only God. One singularity, one seamless singularity, completely focused on God. As soon as you have a tzimtzum, a concealment, God created the environment. There's no evil. The environment of another consciousness, independent consciousness. It's still a consciousness that is completely aware of God, but it is now something else. There is another. The truth is, you could say that even in the highest levels, from Atzmus to Eir. But there, I don't want to go there because that's even more subtle. My point is, the whole Seder Shtalshlus is really, in addition to everything else that it comes to explain how God creates in a logical way and how we can retrace the steps, something I talk about a lot. But it's another thing. It also explains, how is it possible, if all reality is God, how is it possible that a person could lift up their hand against another, let alone murder someone, brutally murder someone? How can we be so blind to the unifying forces that we're all part of one organism? It'd be like saying the body turns against itself. Imagine the heart decides to go to war with the brain, or the right arm with the left arm. Now, there are, unfortunately, autoimmune diseases that the body turns on itself. And we see how tragic it is. There's those skin-eating bacteria or other things that literally turn on itself as if you were turning on an infection. My point is, how do you explain that? You have to explain it in an evolutionary process that slowly, as the light of the divine consciousness gets diminished, the kelim, I'm using kelim as an expression of identity, becomes more tangible, more defined. As that continues, what you're slowly having is the yesh is becoming more powerful, the ayin is becoming more concealed. So till the worlds of akudim, you don't see that. It's all still intense, it's all still in a nucleus, in a concentrated like seed and everything. In Toyu is where you begin to see this becoming a problem. It's not yet full-blown war or evil, but it's a full-blown chaos. The energies are too intense for the containers. There's like a clash, there's tension. Now, tension doesn't always mean it has to lead to total destruction, but it could. And then indeed, there's the shattering of the containers. Then tikkun is the antidote. How do we repair it? But then when you get to Bria, Yitzir, and Asiya, then this evolution continues, or devolution, however you pronounce it, continues to devolve, where the oir is more diminished, the yesh is stronger. More yesh, less oir. Till we come, as he says in Tanya, tachtonim, the lowest of worlds, tachton shein tachton lamatim mimenu, lower, there's nothing lower, and he explains what that means, not in location, not locality lower, in concealment. It's so concealed, he says, that it's a choshech kafel mechupel. I'm quoting Tanya now. A quadrupled darkness, meaning a darkness over a darkness over a darkness over a darkness. Kafel or mechupel. Kafel means double. Mechupel means double. Okay? So now you have concealment that conceals the concealment even. As we know what that means. That means you can convince yourself that it's not concealed. I have the truth when you have is complete sheker, complete falsehood. And then it's Mole Kelipas v'sitra achre. Oh, I should begin. Mole Kelipas v'sitra achre. So Kelipah is a perfect example, because a Kelipah, initially, all it is a shell for a fruit. What's wrong with an apple peel, or an orange peel, or an eggshell, or a walnut? It's fine as long as it knows that it's just a protective shell and husk over the fruit. But what happens if it starts realizing, it starts convincing itself that I'm an entity of my own? The shell tells the fruit, I don't even know that you exist. All is I exist. So the shells become more powerful, the Kelipas. Heichol is the Kelipas Nogah, hence that expression, the chambers of Kelipas Nogah, to the point where the Kelipah is now claiming, I'm the Ikar and you're the Tafel. The fruit is not, I don't even know if there's a fruit. I don't even know if there's a hand of God in my life. I built a parnosa, I built a business. I'm all powerful. I'm self-made man, etc., etc. The fountainhead, self-made man, and that's that. To the point that you become so self-absorbed that you actually can become a greedy, selfish, narcissistic human being and ultimately turn on others. But it's not overnight. It's like the Frierdiker Rebbe says, you don't end up lost in the forest overnight. You veer off a bit, and then you keep going. Then after a while, you're suddenly in a place you're so lost you can't find your way back. So in the same thing in the Shtalshlus, that's the whole point. The Ur gets more diminished. The Ur is awareness of God, basically, the awareness of the divine purpose. The Keli is awareness of yourself. The question is, if you have it balanced, then great. There's a self that's aligned with the divine purpose. But the Chet Tzadas is also a very watershed key moment here, because that's when there was a paradigm shift, that the self became more powerful than the divine self, than the divine purpose, if you wish. And that dissonance ultimately devolves to the point of Avodah Zarah Mamish. We're worshiping ourselves. It began worshiping God, then it began worshiping God's creations, then you began worshiping the creations of creations to the point of self-worship, and then you get, as you know, the rest is history, as they say, and you can get to the worst possible scenarios of real Ra. So if you really want to understand Ra Pichsidis, as I just explained, you have to understand it in this Hishtalshlus manner. If pure evil, yes, ends up being a Hamas on October 7th doing the most brutal possible things. Nazis, Yamach Shemam, doing what they did. All the brutalities and this injustices human beings are capable of. But remember, the Gemara says when you insult another person, it's like you kill them. You make them pale. You take out their blood from them. Obviously, I'm not comparing it to those type of atrocities, but any type of hurt to another essentially is in the same world of a dissonance. The question is how intense it is. So I'm not trying to minimize the real genocide, obviously, just trying to point out that it's gradations that all rooted in the same concept of a dissonance that has gone to the point of completely lost, to the point that you have lost your entire moral compass and you can become a complete mass murderer. And psychologically, you can trace it. You can see a person go back in their lifetime, and you can probably, if you know how to do it well, you can trace how they got from there to here. How did an innocent little newborn become a murderer without a conscience? Just to apply it to psychological. I hope this is helpful in the whole context of, but I'm only saying it because it's very fundamental. It's not so much what he wants to say here, but it does help understand the Nefesh HaBamis's journey, if you wish, from its source downward.
That was extremely helpful. Wow. That was quite an answer to my question. Thank you very much.
Okay. So like if you ask the question, who created the animal soul? Not you and I, God created it. But he created it as a Kelipah, as a type of Kelipah to protect and also serve. But as it devolves and comes downwards, it ends up being like a Nefesh HaBamis that you're born with doesn't mean that you have to be a terrible sinner. It means you have an animal soul, like he explains in Tanya, that's going to tempt you, that's interested in its own survival, fine, but it doesn't have to necessarily cross lines. That's the Avodah Sa'adam. And even if it does, there's ways we're going to learn how to harness it, obviously. The goal is to harness this oil. At the end of the day, there's going to be the oil of the Nefesh HaBamis that's going to be harnessed with the Psila, through the Psila, the Nefesh HaLekith, to create an Eish, a Ner Chanukah, a Ner Shabbos. Yeah. Okay, good. I'm glad I covered this.
Super helpful. And I think it'll also help us untangle it. Like you said, when you understand the anatomy of the Nefesh HaBamis, then it sounds like you're saying we'll connect with that to understand how you transform it, for the sake of Elikus. That's the whole issue, right?
Right, exactly.
Thank you. Those were really amazing, really cool.
Good.
Nice review too of fundamental Chassidus.
And look, in the Pardes of the Ramak and the Tzemach Tzedek in Eira Teira, I think Eira Teira Bereishis it is, or somewhere in the early chapters, explains a lot about how Kelipas came to be. It's in general good to know. When I'm reading it, I've learned that. So to me, when I read Hecholos of Kelipas Nogah or Malachim of Ra, it just comes, I know what it means. But I'm explaining it for those that have not learned that whole concept. But it is a whole sugya in Kabbalah and Chassidus. Yeah. Okay, so we'll stop here at the end of the paragraph on page 368. We're moving along, good. I'm glad we're moving a page a day. It was pretty good. Hope to, wow.